We've covered artificial intelligence, AI, in a number of videos now. As this is a PowerBasic coding channel, it was only a matter of time before we decided to access one of these AI systems from PowerBasic itself. And that's what we're going to be doing today. So in the previous video, we'd installed a version of Ollama on a local machine. This allows us to access a number of large language models locally. So we're currently set up for accessing GPT OSS 120 billion parameters. This is one of the Open AI models. So the first question we have to answer is, does Ollama have an API? An application programming interface is the mechanism by which you can access another application. These interfaces are very useful when you want to access the functionality in a third-party application. So how do we find out if Ollama even has an API? So the obvious way to do this would be either to Google it or perhaps use the locally installed large language model accessed via Ollama to ask the question, does Ollama have an API? And what you can see on screen here is, yes, it does. The local model thought for 9 seconds and gave us an answer. Not only yes does it have it, but links to where the full documentation can be found. And additionally to that, it's telling us how the API is exposed. We're currently running the Ollama client on this machine and we're remote connected to it. It's telling us what the base URL of the website on this machine that Ollama has set up to allow us to access it. And it's using this IP address. This is the local host. And it's using port 11434. This is the default port. You do have the option of changing the port when you start the server. However, we're leaving everything as defaults today. Since Ollama is installed locally, it's a plain HTTP connection. There is no authentication set up out of the box. Because the server is meant to run on a trusted local machine, there is no implementation of either API keys or OAuth. And today we're not going to be accessing it over the network. We're going to be running our PowerBasic application and our connection to the Ollama server on the local machine itself. So if we look further down the document, we'll find there are a number of core endpoints. These are the most common ones you will probably be using. These allow you to do a number of activities inside Ollama. We've already got the Ollama server up and running, and we have also downloaded our 120 billion parameter OpenAI model. So we won't have to use the pull command to pull a model from the Ollama hub. So how can we access these endpoints? What's the physical mechanism we can use? If we look further down the documentation, we'll see there was a quick start with an application called CURL. CURL is a third-party application which comes pre-installed with both Windows 10 and Windows 11. You can also download it from its own website. The version that ships with Windows is usually slightly behind the most recent version on its own website, but it's still perfectly usable. Alternatively, if you're into using Python, you can use a Python client. As we saw in the previous video, once Ollama is actually thinking on a prompt that you have given it, it does take up all of the memory on your machine, plus all of the memory in the graphics card. So once you have given the system a prompt, it will be dedicated to that until it generates an answer. So this is the difference between your own local model and those which you'll access online. The ones online are much larger systems and can support multiple users. Your local system, on the other hand, only supports one at a time. Further down the documentation, you'll find a cheat sheet, which gives you one-liners we can use with CURL. So we're going to try to run this check server version. So first of all, we need to open a command window. And we will switch to the D drive. And there is the folder we're going to be working in. So let's take this script and attempt to run it. If we just paste this in and hit enter, we'll see it returns with a version 0, 11, 10. So we have run our first script using CURL to get information back from Ollama. So can we use another one of these scripts to actually get the system to generate information? Well, let's just move this over a bit so we can keep an eye on what the system's actually doing. Right, I've opened up Process Lasso in the background to give us an idea of how busy the system is. As you can see at the moment, the CPUs are very quiet. There's very little happening on the system. And the system RAM is not heavily loaded. So we're going to run a prompt on the system to generate an output. But first, let's tidy up our command window. I'm using the substitute command to truncate our path down to a letter. It's the drive letter Z. If we do a div on that, we get exactly the same results, but we have much more space on screen. The substitute command is a very old command, dates back to the early Windows days. So here is the script we're going to be running. We're running CURL, we're using HTTP localhost on the specified port number, and the endpoint we're using is API generate. We're giving it a header, we're telling it which model we wish to use, in this case the 120 billion model, which is the one we used in the last video, and our prompt is tell me a joke about cats. And with CURL you can opt to have the output appear in a text file as opposed to appearing on screen. So let's hit enter and see how this runs. And as you can see from the CPU loading and the RAM level, the system is now processing our request. So we will speed through to the end of this processing and see what our result is going to give us. And there is the end of our prompt. We can see that the CPUs are gradually returning to normal and the model is still loaded in RAM. This will step down as it starts to unload. If we have a look in our code folder, we can see we now have an output file. And this output file, if we widen this slightly, is about 6K in size. So let's open the output file and see what's in it. And there is our output file. There is quite a lot of text in here, but if we pick through it, we can see that the user wants a joke about cats, provide a joke, keep tone light, probably a one-liner. So the response we're getting back is, why did the cat sit on the computer? And the answer, because it wanted to keep an eye on the mouse. Not the funniest joke on the planet, but it is coming out of the system. However, there is quite a lot of text in this file. Ideally, we want this just to have the question and the answer, the prompt and the response from the system. You can, of course, write an application which will turn this into something more useful. And as we can see, the memory of the computer is gradually returning to normal as everything unloads. So shortly, we're going to call CURL from inside PowerBasic, running the same script. However, after a bit of delving, I discovered that there's a second way we can actually connect to Ollama. Ollama has a command line interface, which we can use in much the same way. This is exactly the same prompt we used a moment ago. However, you'll see that the syntax of this Ollama CLI is much simpler than the CURL. One of the problems I've had in the past with CURL is getting all the slashes, the quotes, commas, and double quotes in the right places in order for it to syntactically work. The Ollama CLI, by comparison, is much more straightforward. In this case, we just call Ollama run, and then the name of the model we wish to run, and then in quotes, the prompt we want to give it. And at the end, we can actually pipe this information out to a file. So we'll send this to a file called response.txt. So if we return that, we'll see the system gets fully loaded again. and our RAM is stepping up. And there we have our answer. The file we get out, response.txt, is only 1K in size, so it is much smaller. So if we open the file, and there is our response. If we compare it to the original one, it is much cleaner. We have thinking, user wants a joke about cats. Provide a cat joke, should be funny, probably just one joke. And then after it completes thinking, why did the cat sit on the computer? Because it wanted to keep an eye on the mouse. And it's even given us a little icon at the end. So this is a much cleaner way of getting an answer out the system without having to do any parsing of the response. So we've now tried two ways of getting information out of Ollama. Both of these queries give a very simple prompt to the system and expect a response coming out. However, what we're going to do now is we're going to feed Ollama a document, and we're going to ask it to summarize that document. If we have a look in our code file, we'll see there was a document.txt. If we open that up, we'll see this is a larger document. It's about 6,800 characters. This was actually the script for one of my recent videos. So this is what we're going to feed into Ollama, and we're going to ask Ollama to summarize it. So how can we do that in a script? Well, we're using exactly the same approach with Ollama run, the name of the model, our prompt, in this case, please summarize this document. And we're using the pipe in character to feed document text into the system. And we're expecting an output of summary.txt. So if we run that now, you'll see on the left-hand side is a little thinking gadget. This little widget is actually on screen to tell you the system is thinking. And as we can see from the CPU loading, it's using all of the system again. So we'll speed through until that completes. And as the little widget has disappeared, it's now finished thinking and is now generating the document. As you would expect, local systems are never going to be as fast as those online. The online systems are much, much larger and use significantly more powerful hardware. And there the system appears to have finished, and our CPUs are back to normal. And we now have a populated summary.txt. So let's load up the document first. And we'll clear everything else out of the way. So there was our original document. And if we have a look at our summary, and there is our summary. Our summary is a mere 3,200 characters. And we have at the bit at the top where it's thinking the user wants a summary of the provided document. And it has picked out the concise key points in the document and has given us a section on each of these. So this is our summary. So we have successfully used Ollama to summarize a document. This gives us a way of feeding files into the system and getting files back out again, all on the command line. So now that we've achieved that, can we do this from inside PowerBasic? So let's go and generate some code. I'm going to be running today's code in the console compiler, just for convenience. So first of all, in our PB main function, we're going to be calling a brand new function called call_curl. So our first demo is going to be triggering the curl command line and letting it talk to Ollama. And once it comes back with a result, we will trigger a message to the console to say we're finishing processing. We will sleep for 3 seconds and then exit. So let's now create our code in the call_curl function. We're going to create some local variables. One to hold the command line string. This is what we'll be passing to the system to trigger curl. We're going to put the name of the model in a variable, a prompt, the stream, which will be true or false, and the URL, and where we want the output to go. So there are our values. Our URL is the local host, as we did before, using the endpoint of API generate. The model we're still going to be using is the 120 billion Open AI model. our prompt will be "Tell me a joke about cats." The stream option will allow Ollama to send information back as it calculates. This is fairly pointless for this particular prompt as it's a very short prompt and the system only appears to have a single joke about cats. So now that we've populated those variables, let's build up our command line prompt. So here is our command line prompt, triggering CURL, setting the header, setting our model and our prompt and where we want the output to go. So I'm going to also push this string out to a log, and we're going to call that command.text. This is sometimes useful to do this to ensure that the command prompt you're sending is the correct one, as you can compare this against prompts you have created manually. So we'll create this append to file function in a moment, and once we have sent that out to the log, we then want to execute it. So I'm going to create a separate function whose job it will be to execute the command. So here are those two new functions. One to execute the command. This is a function we've used previously in other videos. And the append to file, which again is another function taken from one of our libraries. So if we attempt to compile this, it will compile quite cleanly. So we'll minimize this for the moment. And we can see there is our executable, which we've just compiled. And let's run the application. So our application is running. We know that Ollama has been triggered because we can see the effect on the CPU and the memory. All the CPUs are going flat out. And the amount of RAM being used is stepping up. So we know we're running something on Ollama. Question is, will we get our file output? So we should get a file called output.txt, which, as we can see from the window down here, the file is now 0 in size, so the system has opened it. It appears now to have finished. Yes, it's now finished. And our file is 6K in size. So if we open that up, we'll see it looks remarkably similar to the one we did on the command line. So we have successfully called Ollama from CURL via PowerBasic. So let's go back to the code. So that call has worked successfully. Let's now use the command line for Ollama itself. And we'll create a new function to perform that. And as we did before, we're going to create some local variables. Exactly the same ones as we did before. And we will populate them. And now we will set our parameters. The model is going to be the one we used before. The prompt is again going to be "Tell me a joke about cats." Our response file, which is where we're going to write our output, we're going to put it into the same folder as our executable, and we're going to put it into a file called Ollama response. This will be so that we can compare it against what was in the original response file. And what I'm going to do in this one is I'm going to write this to a batch file, and then we will execute the batch file. And here is our command prompt, much more straightforward than the CURL. Again, it's Ollama run, the name of the model, the prompt in double quotes, and two greater than signs to pipe it out to the response file, which we have designated up here. And just to prevent us having any problems with files lying around if we run this more than once, we will put a try-catch block in to erase each of these files should they currently exist. And we will use the append to file function to write our command string into this batch file. And then we will call our new function, execute command, to execute the batch file. So let's try a quick compile to make sure that compiles cleanly. We will minimize this. And if we run our call Ollama exe once more, we should get a result. So there's our program running. And again, we can see from process lasso at the top right-hand corner of the screen, all the CPUs are running flat out, and the memory is climbing once more. So our code is now running inside the large language model. So we'll speed through until we get a result coming out. And there is the system finishing up processing. And we have our two new Ollama files at the bottom window here. We have the batch file and we have our response. If we open the response up, we'll see it looks remarkably similar to the one we had before. Let's just open the other one up. And we're looking for response. And there is the Ollama response and the original one. Very similar. Slightly different text on the thinking, but the same output. So can we also use this to create a function to generate our summary as we did before on the command line? Let's get back to the code. If for the moment we comment this latest function out, and we'll create a new function to pass that information into the large language model. So first we will create a local variable to hold our input file name and path, document.txt. And we're going to create a new function called call Ollama with input. And this function will return true or false. True if we get an output, and false if we do not. And here is the skeleton of our new function taking its single input parameter. As before, we have a number of local parameters, which we will populate in a moment. Just as a safety measure, we'll make sure that the input file actually exists before we go any further. If the file does not exist, then we will exit the function immediately, which will return a false to the calling routine. So here are our variables populated. Again, the model as before. Our prompt is please summarize this document. The response we're going to write to a file called document summary. And our batch file is going to be the same batch file name. And there is our command line setup. Again, Ollama run, the model name, the prompt, the input file which we passed in, and the file we wish to write to for the output, which is going to be document summary. And again, since we might be running this more than once, we will try to erase each of these files, the batch file and the response file. And exactly as we did before, we will append all this to our command line and we will execute the batch file. So with all that in place, let's try a test compile to ensure it compiles cleanly. And then we will prepare to run again. There is our executable if we double click on it. And there's our batch file. We're now processing. And we can see the CPUs are now fully loaded. And the memory is again climbing. So we know Ollama is processing in the background. And we should get our output in the document summary.txt, which should give us an output that's remarkably similar to summary.txt. So we will speed through to the end of this processing. And there is our file finished processing. So let's have a look at the document summary. And there we have our document summarized. If we compare that against the original, I think we have a slightly larger, we do indeed, we have a slightly larger summary the second time round. Interesting. Just goes to show when you ask one of these large language models a question, asking the same question again later does not necessarily give you exactly the same answer. However, it's a reasonable summary. So, in summary, what we've achieved today is we have ran a number of API calls against Ollama, using both CURL and Ollama's own command line interface. We've given it a simple prompt, requiring a simple answer. We've also fed a document into the system and asked it to summarize it. There's a great deal more we could do with the Ollama API, but we'll leave that for a later video. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching today's video. Please feel free to click on the link in the description below to discover more videos.